Welcome back for another college 12 pack, another college football preview show. Last week we tackled the ACC. This week, as you're getting ready for your July 4th holiday, we're going to talk about the Big 12. And there's Tyler. This is an interesting one. Maybe not because of the top brands like the Big 10 or the SEC have. But it's intriguing because you have a Colorado team that's coming back to the Big 12 for the first time since 2011. You have a Utah team who seems to dominate everywhere they go under Kyle Whittingham and the things that he does. And then you have the two Arizona schools who were one's ahead of the other, but maybe the Sun Devils can make some ground up this upcoming season. And of course, you have what Texas fans called the Hateful Eight, the 8 teams that weren't happy that Texas and Oklahoma were leaving prior to this season. But let's kick it off. Let's jump right into it. We got offensive player of the year superlatives here in really. I think we both agree on this player that kind of you picked, but just to be devil's advocate, I went a different route. Kind of went 1B, but you got Noah Papita at Arizona, and I think for the head coach, it was a massive win that he didn't go to Washington and follow Jed Fish.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people thought that he was going to. There was a lot of speculation that he was, going to enter the portal and be Washington bound. But yeah, new coach Brent Brennan keeps him around, which is, I mean, huge considering they did take some losses in the portal following Jed Fish's departure. So keeping Noah Fifita around, who really was one of the best quarterbacks in the country last year and kind of, came out of nowhere to do it because he was a backup to start the year behind Jaden DeLora, who was a pretty good and productive quarterback for Arizona the last couple of years. And then Jaden DeLora gets hurt. Noah Fifita steps in with injury and is arguably even better. Was really efficient last year, 25 touchdowns and only 6 picks, finished with a 165 rating, like 72% completion. Those are all very positive marks. And I led a very effective offense. I think, we maybe question what it's going to look like, under a new system. But I mean, coming into the Big 12, I think, Arizona is maybe poised to compete in year one, if for no other reason than the fact that they have, Noah Fifita and some nice pieces around him.
Yeah, you're talking about a guy who was a freshman All-American, and yeah, you kind of alluded to it. It wasn't that Jaden DeLora was bad by any means. It was just that Papita was that much better. And I think going into this year, there's a lot of positive, even though maybe Brent Brennan wasn't the savvy hire that maybe a lot of people would want, considering when it happened in the cycle. However, you still have to like what his ties to that region. I think he's going to do a pretty good job. But Papita is a guy who I think will make some noise this year, and a large reason why Arizona can be one of those teams that ends up playing at AT&T Stadium in Arlington for the Big 12 title game at the end of the year. We'll get into our game picks here shortly. But I'm going to go with the guy who's the reigning Doak Walker Award winner, Ollie Gordon II out of Oklahoma State. He was just a dynamic athlete last year. Just his ability to run the football, his ability to get into the end zone, and he seemed like a guy that kind of burst onto the radar and kind of just sustained himself. And, a large reason why Oklahoma State was able to make that big turnaround after getting blown out at home by South Alabama and able to get to the Big 12 title was because of the play of Ollie Gordon. And I think, going into this year, I don't see that there's going to be a massive change in the philosophy and the way that they do things. Mike Gundy has done this complete shift where he was so offense oriented, and for an offensive guy, you think it's going to stay that way. And Oklahoma State kind of became a defensive team, run the football, kind of slow the game down rather than speed it up. Maybe they have some up tempo when it comes to running the football, but for the most part, winning or losing will fall on the back of Ollie Gordon II in 2024.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great pick. Like when I was making my picks for this, like I really went back and forth on these two. I think they're pretty clearly 1A, 1B to me. I mean, I think Ollie Gordon maybe has an argument for being the best player in the entire country coming into the 2024 season. I mean, when you look at what he did last year, I mean, single-handedly kind of turned Oklahoma State's season around. And just absurd production, really. Like it's over 1,700 yards on the ground, 21 touchdowns, 330 yards in the air too. Like this guy can make an impact in the in the passing game. So a versatile back too. Finished seventh in Heisman voting. Like I'm with you. I don't really see what's going to change this year, other than maybe the fact, like the one thing I'd maybe like to see is, now that, like you said, he kind of emerged last year, and now that everyone knows, what Ollie Gordon's capable of, you do maybe wonder if they'll be able to key in on him at all if this passing game with Alan Bowman doesn't improve. I think that's maybe my question is, will they be too one-dimensional for it to be as successful as it was? But I mean, I think he's got the talent that even if that ends up being the case, he'll probably still finish with a very productive season.
Oh, absolutely. I think, you're dead on there when you look at his production and how he played. And like I said, if there's success for Oklahoma State, it's because of him. And hopefully by the end of the year, he gets some of that Heisman love. I know typically that's going to quarterbacks year in and year out, but when you look at what the job that he's done, I think you have to include him in that short list of top players. Now, going defensive player of the year, uh, obviously I'm a big tech guy, and I'm going to go with a tech guy here. I'm going to go with Ben Roberts, who really burst onto the scene last year as a redshirt freshman. One of the top linebackers in the country, I think, especially in the Big 12. He tallies over triple digits in tackles, 6.5 tackles for loss. He's not a guy that's going to get in the backfield a lot and do sacks, but having that sure tackler, a guy who can kind of slow things down in space, is massive. And on top of that, he did have 2 forced fumbles, so he's a guy who can create and get the ball back for your offense. And I think just looking around the Big 12, I mean, there were some easy answers, but I think Ben Roberts is just as good as a lot of those guys who and coming the fact that he plays at Texas Tech is probably a guy that you probably don't know a lot about.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly didn't know a ton about him before, kind of doing the research for this. I mean, it's certainly a bit of an under the radar pick, but like I do like it. I think that could end up being a pretty good pick at the end of the day. Like you said, a really productive redshirt freshman season last year. Finished at over 100 tackles. Like, was already one of the better linebackers in the Big 12 in his first campaign. And I mean, I think you could pretty easily see, him taking the leap to being like the best, like, first team all Big 12 caliber. So, I mean, maybe a little bit of projection involved there, but like, I think it's pretty easy to see something like that happening.
Yeah, I think for something like that to happen, you're going to have to see maybe some more sacks or create some interceptions, things of that nature. But I don't think it's too far out of the realm possibility. Then on the other hand, we probably have the best two-way player in all of college football, Travis Hunter, Colorado, coming in. There's a lot of hype around him, and if you watched any of Colorado last year, they weren't winning a lot of football games. I believe they went 4-8 in Dion's first year in Boulder. Uh, but when Travis Hunter was on the field, he was definitely one that you had to pay attention to.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like I think you could make an argument for this being the pick for offensive player of the year too. I mean, was very productive as a receiver last year when he was on the field. But like I think he's maybe even better as a corner. Like there's not really been a lot of clarity given by like either him or Dion on what kind of split he's gonna, like if he's gonna play full time at both positions this year. Which one he prefers as like a pro prospect. Like we don't really know that, but it seems to me like most NFL guys I follow are treating him as a defensive back prospect, which is kind of why I went with the defensive side here. But I think he has the potential to, I think, take a big step forward this year as a defensive player. I think maybe got a bad rap because of that game against Stanford where he just got torched by Alec Iomenor. Like, was a really bad game for him. But, he's a true freshman defensive back playing in a pretty good offensive conference. Like, that's going to happen. I don't really read too much into that. And I think you have to really like the traits with him as a defensive player. Like, he's so fast and athletic. Like, he can close gaps really quickly. He can bait quarterbacks. And he also has good tackling like for a guy that plays like that. So I think just a really well-rounded cornerback prospect. And you just worry, he had the injury last season. That wasn't really a usage injury, but, you still worry about a guy playing this many snaps. Will he be able to do that over the course of a season? I think that remains to be seen. But if he can, I think he could end up being, an absolute superstar.
Yeah, and you talk about the catch radius of a wide receiver. How about the radius of the ability for this guy just to get to balls, athletically, on the defensive side of the ball. He can make that acrobatic interception, or just knock the ball away. There's so much, and I think you're right. When in terms of looking at this guy, could this guy be the offensive player of the year? Absolutely. Could he be the defensive player of the year? Absolutely. Could he do both? Probably. I mean, he's that talented. I wouldn't be shocked. If you would have put Travis Hunter in both sections, I wouldn't have been surprised. But also just speaks to the, kind of what we see like right now at the baseball level with Shohei Ohtani, right? He's the best pitcher and one of the best batters in all of baseball. And then that's kind of what Travis Hunter is kind of proving, that he could be the best wide receiver, the best cornerback, the best all around player. And I think, if you put him on special teams and have him return punts and kicks, he'd probably do well in that aspect as well. Just all around. But I think Travis Hunter's a great pick there. Like I said, I felt like if you didn't pick him, I was going to, but because I think those guys are right up there. Let's talk newcomer of the year, and we're gonna go to Utah. We talked a little bit about Utah early on, but Dorian Singer, who played at Arizona, was fantastic. Goes to USC and is kind of the forgotten man. It seemed like in that offense. There was a lot going on there at USC, by the way. But now he goes to Utah and he gets quarterback Cam Rising. And I think this is a great situation for him, and a big reason why I think you're right. He could be the newcomer of the year just based on what we've seen of him in the past. But can he get there again?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know what to make of what happened with Dorian Singer last year. I mean, obviously, joined a team with more talent on the roster, so I'm not surprised that the production diminished a little bit, but I'm not really sure why he ended up being such an afterthought. With a really good quarterback and Caleb Williams, like just didn't. I mean, production dropped from like 1,100 yards in 2022 with Arizona to like 200 something, I think this past year. So, like that is a concern, but I think he is really poised to get back to where he was at Arizona. Now joining a Utah team that just really desperately, needs some athleticism and talent out there at receiver. And I think, he really could make an immediate impact for this offense when you consider that they get Cam Rising back at quarterback. Like I think so many of this team's offensive problems last year stemmed from not having Cam Rising. And we'll see, how he looks, where his health's at, but he's now like 2 years removed from that injury almost. So, hopefully he's made that recovery and is doing all right now. But I mean, I think if that is all, if everything's okay with that, I think Dorian Singer is poised to have a huge bounce back year.
Yeah, and I think when you look at USC, that that team comes with distractions, right? I mean, just playing in that kind of there's a lot of pressure, and I think maybe going to Utah allows him to get more relaxed, and then that brings the impact level up. And you're right, when you look at Utah, they have some really good tight ends. That they're going to be able to throw the football to. They did lose their running back, Jaquinda Jackson, to the transfer portal, but they still have plenty of talent there. Obviously, bringing Cam Rising back is going to change things, but I think it's a great pick with Dorian Singer there. Once again, I'm going to go back to Lubbock, Texas, and I'm going to go with freshman Micah Hudson, first 5-star ever to sign at Texas Tech since they started tracking recruiting in 2000. I think this is a guy who he's not going to start right away. I don't think, especially when you look at the guys that are in front of him with Josh Kelly, Caleb Douglas, Coy Eakin, Brady Boyd, Dre McCray. I mean, they have some talent throwing the football, but I think eventually this is a guy who's going to kind of take over. When you look at him through all of the camps and different things that he's done over the years, he's just too dynamic of a player to not get him the football. And I think, especially if he builds that rapport with Baron Morton. I really think that Hudson can be a guy who can kind of elevate this offense a little bit and give them that playmaker they haven't really seen since Jakeem Grant. If you remember Jakeem Grant, he was a 5'6" guy, but he was a speed demon, and he would make defenses look silly.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to imagine that Micah doesn't play a pretty significant role in year one, even if he's not a day one starter. I mean, I think it is hard to ask a true freshman to have that kind of impact, even one as talented as Micah Hudson, and even one that is, I mean, he's just, the talent caliber relative to the team. You expect that that's gonna be noticeable from day one. I mean, he's probably the most talented. I mean, certainly the most talented from a stars rating perspective, skill position player Tech's ever had. I mean, probably from even a true talent perspective, you could argue he's the best they've had, or at least highest ceiling they've had since Michael Crabtree. So, I think it's tantalizing. Like, I don't know how much of an impact he's going to have this year, which would be my only hang up to naming him newcomer of the year with some of the other pieces in this league. But I mean, I think the potential is there, especially if you're getting good quarterback play out of Baron Morton this year.
Yeah, and you have to like what you saw from Baron Morton down the stretch last year, going 4-1 as a starter, leading them to the bowl victory over California. Now, mind you, California wasn't a world beater when it comes to teams, but they were much improved, and they had a really good running back in Jaden Ott. I thought that game was a really good display of two really good running backs, with Taj Brooks being the other, who's also back on the team, and I think that allows defenses not to just zone in on the quarterback or zone in on the wide receivers, because you've got a guy like Taj Brooks back there who can kind of mess things up for defenses the way that he runs the football. But just looking at it, but yeah, is there a projection there? Absolutely. Are there other guys who are more likely to be newcomer of the year? Yes, I do think so. There's some guys that I kind of toyed with, but I just kept coming back to the fact that Micah Hudson is going to prove to be the most talented wide receiver on this team when it's all said and done. And I think that begins this year, and I think he will see an impact. Now, typically, Tyler and I are kind of differing on player of the year. We obviously did with offensive, defensive, and newcomer. When it comes to head coach, we both agree. I think we're both very bullish on Kyle Whittingham as one of the top three head coaches in all of college football. He doesn't have the national title as some of the others that might, like a Dabo, a Kirby, those guys. But when it comes to consistency and getting the most out of the least, for me, Kyle Whittingham is the best coach in college football in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, I think he'd be right up there with like Brian Kelly in terms of best coaches that haven't won a national title. And I think he comes into this league pretty strong argument to make for being the best coach in it, or at least most proven coach, in year one, because I mean, the level of consistency he's achieved at Utah. I mean, like, we talk about it, but I'm not sure we even give them enough credit because, I mean, so he was obviously very successful, pre-transition to the Power Five back when they were in the Mountain West when he took over for Urban. But like, even since they made that jump, like 13 years ago, 14 years ago, something like that, in that span, 4 10-win seasons, which pretty amazing. Even considering the Pac-12 has been down for a lot of that time, that's still pretty wild. And then to have the conference titles too. And I still think, even though they sort of slid back to 8-5 last year, I think it was still a pretty good season, all things considered, when you take into account, what they were missing at quarterback and at tight end with Brant Keithy. Like, they suffered a lot of really big losses and still ended up being a competitive team, if not one of the best in the Pac-12, but still, a team that you don't really want to play. And I think that's kind of Utah's primary identity. And I think because of that, they're poised to have pretty immediate success here. Like, I could see this team being very good in year one of the Big 12. I mean, we'll get into this later, but I could see this team winning the Big 12 pretty easily.
Yeah, they're one of the better teams coming in. Absolutely, I think like when you talk about the upper echelon of the Big 12 right now, I think there's probably 3 or 4 teams you throw in there. I think you would say Kansas State. I think you would say Oklahoma State just based on what they've done in recent years. There's Utah and Kansas is kind of working their way up there. We'll kind of see who else kind of stands up. I would think Arizona is going to be up there as well, based on what they've kind of looked like last year. But we'll see. Was that a product of Jed Fish, or was it the talent around them? We'll find out. There's a lot to be excited about. But let's talk about our surprises for the upcoming season. Now, we kind of have talked about the teams that we expect to do well: Oklahoma State, Utah, and the like. But when it comes to surprise teams, I think I might be shocking some people here. I'm going to go with the Arizona State Sun Devils. I just think that when you look at what Willingham is doing out there in Tempe, or Dillingham, I think he's really building something there, and it's going to be a slow process. It wasn't great last year. But I think this year with Sam Levitt and Jeff Sims at the quarterback position, you have Troy Omier, former Texas Longhorns wide receiver who couldn't stay healthy. He kind of showed a little bit last year. You have Jake Smith, another guy who played at Texas, transferred to USC, and now he's out at Arizona State. I think they got some talent on the offensive side of the ball that can really make some noise. And then defensively, you look, they have a lot of guys who transferred in and are expected to be starters this year. But I think if they win five games, I think that's a big surprise for kind of what we've seen from Arizona State, and just where they were just a couple years ago, and just how dreadful that program was prior to Dillingham's arrival. But I would might surprise some people, but I would not be surprised if they said that if you told me by the end of this upcoming season they have 6 wins and qualified for a bowl game.
Yeah, I mean, I think sitting somewhere in that range, like the pushing for bowl eligibility range, this year in the Big 12, I think would be huge. That'd be really nice progress, I think, for them. I mean, I'll say this: I really like Kenny Dillingham. I like the job he's doing. I think he's the right guy for that job, and I think he will get it rolling eventually. And after the way they played last year, there really is nowhere to go but up. I mean, they were pretty bad last year. I don't know if I buy this team taking a significant leap this season. I don't know if there's been enough improvement to that roster. Like, I look at the quarterback situation. I mean, it's tough. They lost Jaden Rashada in the portal to Georgia. I think that was probably always going to be kind of a 1-year rental thing, and he battled injuries and struggled a bit, so it just didn't work out that well. And you look at the quarterback situation, and it's not particularly inspiring. You got, like you mentioned them, Sam Levitt, a Michigan State transfer who hasn't played a ton. And then Jeff Sims, who has played a ton at Georgia Tech and Nebraska, but, kind of is who he is. I don't think either of us are too gung-ho on Jeff Sims as a college quarterback. So that doesn't inspire me too much. They were really active in the portal, like you said, like added a ton of new starters, particularly on defense. I just don't think it was enough. Like, I still look at this roster relative to everyone else in the league, and I still think it is probably a bottom tier Big 12 team, like maybe at or near the bottom, along with, the Baylors and the Cincinnatis of the world. So, and I don't think anything's changed enough this year for me to say otherwise. So, like I said, I think that if this team can be pushing for a bowl bid, I think that would be tremendous progress. I'm not sure I see that happening
And that's what's the beauty of this conversation, right? We talk about teams who we think might be there, who might not be, and I could be wrong. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time. But just based on the trajectory, and more of a belief in what Kenny Dillingham is doing. I would say more so the believing in the coach and what he's able to do. I think what he was able to get out of Bo Nix at Oregon, I think, just speaks volumes to what he can do. I'm a big Bo Nix fan, but I also understand the ceiling versus the floor with him. Uh, for surprise team for you, you're going with a guy who, a team who's led by a guy who's kind of been a pain for some coaches. When you talk about Gus Malzahn, the UCF Knights, last year I thought that they were really one that was going to contend in the Big 12. And they had a very disappointing season. I think a lot of that had to do with the injury to John Reese Plumlee. But going into this year, they bring over it's another SEC guy who's going to come play for Gus Malzahn. And you talk about KJ Jefferson, which he had a really weird offseason because we thought he might stay at Arkansas. Then all of a sudden he's in the portal, and now he's at UCF, and now getting an opportunity to play around a I hate to say it, it kind of feels like a much more talented team than the Arkansas Razorbacks, or at least that's the perception I have right now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really think it was ever like reasonable to expect UCF to be ultra competitive in the Big 12 in their first season. Like, I don't think they had the roster for that. But with that being said, like I actually think it was a fairly nice campaign. I mean, they went 6-7, which isn't ideal, but I think they were a lot more competitive than that record would show. Like when you look at their season, they had 3 losses last year that were by 2 points or less. One of those was against number 6 Oklahoma. Another one was a squandered like 3 touchdown lead against Baylor. So like this very easily could have been a 9-3 type deal. And I think we're talking about this team and program a lot differently if that's the case. And like them's the breaks, you got to win the games. But I think, you kind of expect there to be some positive variance there this year just because of how close so many of those games were. And I really like Gus Malzahn as a coach. I think he's, among the better coaches in this new collection of teams. And I really like the KJ Jefferson pickup too. A guy who was very productive playing quarterback in the SEC, and like really the only reason that Arkansas was relevant or scared teams at all over the last couple seasons. So I think that's a good fit. I think it's, he's on a better roster now, like you said. And, if we're talking like team that I think could be a dark horse to win this league, this would probably be the one that comes to mind.
Yeah, it's interesting enough. KJ Jefferson's going to be throwing to a pair of former SEC wide receivers, both coming from Auburn. Kobe Hudson, who returns for another year, UCF. Jabarius Johnson, who just transferred in. He was originally, I believe he was originally recruited by Gus Malzahn. So now you got a couple of those guys. You talked about, KJ Jefferson. RJ Harvey was a really good running back for this team last year. And he returns. I think he brings a little something. And then defensively, you've got a bunch of transfers coming in, including Trey Pagans playing one of those cornerback positions. I think talent wise, they've got it. And I wouldn't be surprised, like you said, if they were a dark horse. But I kind of feel like they're in that second tier going into this season. They can obviously, elevate beyond that, but right now I would say they're in that next tier beyond the guys that we really think are going to be there. And which brings us to our next conversation point. Tyler, let's talk about our Big 12 title game matchup. And we differ here, but we both agree that Utah will be there. Just looking at the team, getting Rising back, the boost in the arm that's going to be for that team is a big reason why we're going there. I go with Kansas State just because once again, I love the job that Chris Kleiman does with Kansas State. And, I think despite the fact that they lost Will Howard, I think Avery Johnson's going to do a well enough job for them. Obviously, they've added some talent at the running back position. They've added some talent just throughout, and I think there's a big reason why I think Utah Kansas State will be the Big 12 matchup when we get to the title game later this year.
Yeah, so this was, like I said, like you said, we're in agreement on Utah. And this was one where I also went back and forth between Kansas State and Oklahoma State, who I ultimately picked. And I mean, I think the reason that I ultimately went with Oklahoma State is looking at this Kansas State roster. Like, even though they lost Will Howard, who I think is a good quarterback, like I've talked a lot about how I think he's going to raise the ceiling at Ohio State this year. I actually don't think they really have many quarterback woes because I think they're really high on Avery Johnson. Has looked good when he's played. Was a former blue chip recruit, which you don't really see them land quarterbacks like that very often out in Kansas State. So really intriguing player. I think he's going to be fun to watch. My questions really have nothing to do with him. It's more about what's around him. Because this team returns, at least on the offensive side of the ball, very little production. One of the worst teams in returning production in the country, actually. The biggest addition offseason wise was Dante Cephas, a transfer from Penn State, previously played at Kent State. I mean, you certainly hope that's going to be a pretty productive move, but aside from that, like not a ton to really to get hyped about. The one thing you can get excited about is this veteran defense that has almost everyone back from last year, ranks 4th in returning production, brings back 80% of its production. So if you're talking me into Kansas State, it's because of that defense. But looking at the team that I ultimately picked in Oklahoma State, it's like, you know, like I said earlier, they need more from Alan Bowman. Was not great last year, even though he was ultimately able to secure the job. But they still have, a veteran defense also, and just so many pieces. Like, I think the thing that put me over the edge with this Oklahoma State team was just how much they bring back on both sides of the ball. They rank fourth overall in returning production and are top 15 on both sides. So, which team do I have more confidence in? It's probably the one that, made it to the Big 12 title game last year and is more or less running it back.
Yeah, and I think when you look at Oklahoma State, and we talked about Ollie Gordon, who I talked about early on. Yeah, I think you're right. Alan Bowman doesn't give you like a ton of confidence based on what we saw of him early on last year. He got better as the year went on, but how much of that play was because teams were focused on stopping Ollie Gordon versus the elevated play of Bowman. But I also do like the fact that they bring back Brennan Presley, who's one of their best returning wide receivers, a guy that I think that you can count on. They have some other options at the wide receiver position, but yeah, they're a team that you look defensively. They got one of the best linebackers in the country, Nick Martin, kind of kind of like a stalwart there in the middle. Just looking up and down. You're right. The returning production and the fact that they were there, I understand that completely. Uh, my pick for Kansas State was a little bit more of trusting Kleiman versus trusting Alan Bowman at quarterback. And again, I'm a Tech guy. I watched Bowman for 3 years in Lubbock. Um, he's an injury prone quarterback and he has a hard time staying on the field. And if Bowman goes down, looking at the quarterbacks behind him, they're going to have big problems, as we saw last year when Bowman wasn't the quarterback for the Oklahoma State Cowboys. But once again, I think either pick. I mean, I think Oklahoma State, Kansas State was kind of always going to be that pick, whether I was making it or you were making it. However, with that being said, we both agree that Utah. No, actually, no. You have Utah. I did. I went back and forth on this. Utah, you have winning the Big 12 title, where I have Kansas State because once again I believe in climate. However, I almost put Utah so that we could agree on this, but for argument's sake, I'm going to say Kansas State. But I still don't think that that's far fetched. And one aspect, I think, adding, you talked about Avery Johnson and being the blue chipper. They have DJ Giddens at running back, but they also added Dylan Edwards, who comes over from Colorado after he had a somewhat productive season for Dion. I think maybe they're looking for that guy who can be that next little small scat back that they've won. They've won a lot of football games with, and obviously he's not Deuce Vaughn, but maybe perhaps he can give him a little bit of that juice on the offensive side of the ball, running back, to help them win the title in 2024.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the potential, and I really like Chris Kleiman. I really believe in Chris Kleiman. I just believe in Kyle Whittingham even more, I think. And, you know, I just, with Kansas State, with all the new pieces, even though I like a lot of them, like I think a lot of them have the potential to be very good, there's just a little too much there for me to say that I think this team can win the conference in year one. Whereas, for me, it's like a similar line of logic for you with Kansas State, with Utah. Like, I just have so much belief in that staff and the consistency they're able to achieve that my money would just be on them to be the team that's in that 9-10 win range. And any given game, I think it'd be a fascinating championship game between Utah and Kansas State, because it's just two teams that play, I think, a very similar style of football, just physical, beat you down. Like, it'd be a really interesting game. But I think I would go with Utah, which is, I think, just the more talented roster and better staff
and better quarterback. I mean, you could go on and on.
I mean, maybe that one I'm not necessarily sure about. I think it could be.
I guess when I look at Cam Rising, you better be really good. I mean, you're coming back for like your 7th year.
Yeah.
But which, ironically enough, Tyler Shugg, Alan Bowman, and Cam Rising were all part of the same recruiting class. And they're all three coming back for another year of college football, which is wild to me. Okay, so with that being said, we have an expanded playoff build, 12 teams. There are 5 champions, 7 at-large bids. Will the Big 12 get more than one team in this expanded field? Simple answer, Tyler. Go.
Yeah, I'm saying no. I think it's a better chance that it happens than for example for the ACC, which we talked about last episode. Like I think I could see it happening. I think when you look at an Oklahoma State or a Kansas State, could one of those be a 10 or 11 win team that doesn't win this conference? I think it's possible. I think it's possible. I just really for the same reasons. Like I think you're basically going to be guaranteed to make this playoff field as a 9-win SEC or Big Ten team. I mean, I'm sure there's going to be exceptions to that here and there, but I think as a general rule of thumb, you can probably be feeling pretty good about your postseason chances if you have 9 wins in the regular season and you're in one of those two conferences. So I think because of that, like I think you're going to have to be a pretty strong 10-win team to beat out some of those teams as a Big 12 squad. And I just don't think that whoever doesn't win this conference will be in a position to do that. Like if I had to bet on it right
Yeah, I can't disagree with that. When you look at kind of the teams that are going to be there, I think we both agree that there's going to be a lot of Big Ten talk as far as getting multiple teams in an SEC. And let's say you got a Notre Dame team that's an 11 or 12 win team. Again, they're taking another spot, right? And that I think that kind of works against the opportunity to get multiple teams in. So I would also say no on this one. I don't think that they can get multiple teams in unless you have a team go unscathed through the entire season and lose in the Big 12 title game and you're sitting there at 12-1. I
now.
think
Yeah,
they would
I
be
think
hard pressed to not put you in.
I think that's
I think
probably the best bet.
Yeah, so I would say I'll say no with the caveat that if a team runs the table in the regular season, or we end up with two 12-1 teams at the end of the year. Maybe somebody lost early and went on a run. Regardless, I think that's kind of how that would have to play, but I'm going to go with no. So I had this question written down: which newcomer will have the best season? And as I'm sitting here thinking about it, that's probably a dumb question, right, Tyler? Because I think we know who's going to have the best season of the newcomers. It's clearly Utah. We both picked them to go to the title game. You picked them to win. I picked them to lose. But I think the better question here would be which team has the worst season? Which of the new team? Because I think there you can have a conversation. Uh, and I just wanted to kind of throw this curveball at you. I'm gonna say Colorado. In terms of not that they will have a worse season than Arizona State, but that the expectation is that they're going to be a lot better than they were last year based on all the upgrades that they made to the offensive line. But I still see them as bowl eligible. Yeah, 6 wins, finishing 6-6, 6-7, somewhere around there.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of who's going to have the most disappointing season, I'd probably agree with that. I think in terms of just objectively speaking, which is the worst team of these newcomers, I'd probably still lean Arizona State.
Yep.
I think, I mean, man, like if they win 6 games, I think that'd be pretty solid. I think, you could very easily see them have a pretty similar season to what they had this past year. I mean, the talent is there. Like they are going to be a wild card because they have Shador Sanders and Travis Hunter and guys like that. But, none of that's going to matter if the offensive line doesn't take a step forward because Shador was fighting for his life every single snap last season. And I don't think they're going to improve much if that doesn't change. And, it's just hard to say because they portaled basically an entirely new offensive line again. And it was pretty good pickups, but that's really hard to project. I think the jury's definitely still out on how effective portaled offensive lines can be. So I think we'll have to wait and see on that one. Like I mentioned earlier, I think ASU still rebuilding. I don't think this is going to be the year where they're, ultra competitive. And I think Arizona has the talent to be competitive. I think I wouldn't pick them to be in that upper echelon of the Big 12 this year just because I think there's enough new pieces on the roster and new coaching staff, even though I like the new coaching staff generally, I think that's going to be too many changes this year for them to really put something special together this year in year one. But I think they would probably be the team that outside of Utah, I expect to have the best season.
Yeah, I think you're right. And going back to your point about offensive lines and portaling an entire offensive line, that's the one group that needs that continuity that you can't get over an off season, right? I think playing, we've seen it time and time again where a offensive line doesn't really start clicking till much later in the season. And if that's the case for Colorado and they don't start clicking till late, how far behind are they already when it comes to their ability to play together? But I think we're in agreement there. But that's going to do it for this edition of the College 12 Pack. We'll be back next week. We're going to dive into some Big Ten football. And the upcoming release of the College Football 25. We're probably going to have an entire show just dedicated to that because I think for those of us who have missed out on that game for the last decade plus, we couldn't be more excited about the upcoming release of College Football 25. But for Tyler and Patrick, we'll see you next week.